This is the Educational Triage Podcast. Welcome. We invite you to come along with us on an exploration of interviews, issues, and other exciting and relevant topics in education, especially alternative education. They say alternative education is a laboratory for mainstream education. Why? Well, join us every week and listen in as Philip Summers
Aloha.
and I, Tony Hunt, jump in feet first to discuss issues that may affect our classes, students, communities, as well as our teaching. Please subscribe if you enjoy and find relevance in what you experience here. And if you haven't left a quick review, please do. We appreciate your candor and insights so we can improve as we move forward. Now, let's see what's on board today. And welcome back to the Educational Triage Podcast, people. And we are so over the moon right now. We have an exciting show. We have Tara Garcia Mathewson from the Hechinger Report. Hey, Tara.
Hi. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. And we also have, of course, our Philip. Hey, Philip.
Aloha. Good to see you again.
So, Tara, why don't you give us a little bit of background on your research and your reporting, and let's see where we go from there.
Yeah, so I guess the framing for all of this reporting for me, I came back from a year-long maternity leave in September of 2021, and this was the point where basically the entire country was reopening after pandemic-related school closures. I was trying to catch up on a year's worth of not being up on education news. And a lot of what I kept seeing was student behavior being a problem in schools. And reading back, I was seeing that in the prior year, there had been a lot of warnings from student advocates, from psychologists, from social workers saying we need to anticipate that students are going to come back to schools with a lot of needs and we need to be ready for it. And so I was curious about whether schools were reopening ready for it. And as I was seeing a lot of reporting of just really difficult student behavior, I was curious about whether suspensions were coming back really stronger than ever, or whether schools were reopening with some kind of trauma-informed and ready for what people knew that they should have expected. And so I actually started all the discipline reporting with some records requests to medium and large districts around the country, and saw that basically all of them, suspension had returned to pre-pandemic levels, and some of them suspensions were higher than pre-pandemic, and in just a handful, suspensions were lower. And so you have districts like Dallas that had introduced this entirely new or I guess they had expanded a concept of reset centers where they were trying to get rid of suspensions. You know, there were some around the country that were trying more innovative things or expanding programs to try and reduce suspensions. But it was clear that, we came back from years of interrupted learning when it became very clear how important it was for kids to be in school. And we were doing the same thing that we've always done in terms of kicking kids out. And so that was the beginning of my kind of exploration of punitive discipline. And like you said, I went on to explore corporal punishment. I went very deep into a school in a county in Mississippi for that story. Mississippi has long been the leader in corporal punishment use. And then in Arizona, went very deep onto the practice of suspending students for absenteeism and attendance-related infractions. And then the last big project that I worked on was in California about how schools push students out through the transfer process. So it feels a lot like an expulsion to a student, but it's recorded as a transfer, and therefore it's a less transparent form of exclusionary discipline, and it's also one in which students do not have due process protections or just as much due process and kind of regulation from the state.
So I know that with the corporal punishment in the 19 states that have it, and when you did your story down in Mississippi, that the parents could sign an opt-out form, but they would still bypass that if they felt that it was more expeditious to paddle the student. So
Yeah.
Um, I'm just I'm just curious as to, because to me it seems antiquated. I think I was in second or third grade when they got rid of that here
Hmm.
in our schools. So, because I'm talking 66, 67, I think it was. And
I was
so,
paddled in '67.
were you
Yes, I was
in school?
in school. The
Wow.
principal took me to his office and made me hold my ankles and paddle me.
Do you remember
Wow.
what you did?
Yeah, I retaliated. I was being picked on by a kid, and he picked a fight, and they saw me. It was the retaliator got seen, and so I was the one that got in trouble. I was bitter because I was just defending myself. Yeah.
So it just seems as though we've made so much progress, and yet 19 states, which is just unfathomable to me, have held on to that practice. Is there any real reason why? Were you able to probe any kind of psychological rationale that they have for doing that?
Yes, I tried to get deep into that. I tried to talk to a lot of people who supported corporal punishment, and actually in this county in Mississippi, um, I think in a lot of ways it made me think of inertia and the way that things keep going as they are until they're interrupted, and these opt-out options help prevent backlash. They so basically you can have a school system where the only kids who get paddled, as they call it in Mississippi, the only kids who get paddled are the ones whose parents support it and are probably using some form of corporal punishment at home as well. And so, as kind of culture has changed over time, and more people disapprove of corporal punishment, you have a smaller and smaller group of kids who are even eligible for it. One, because most kids don't go to schools where principals allow it, and even if they do, their parents support it. And so kids are not the ones who have power in schools, as you know. And so if kids are the ones who don't want it, they're not in positions to get rid of it. And so the parents who don't want it often get to opt their kids out, and so then stop fighting for, the system as a whole or other children. Um, so I think there's been kind of a protection of the practice because of that structural factor. Um, and then I think, it remains in communities where it's very common at home. And so if it's common at home for a lot of families, it doesn't seem like much of a stretch. And a key part of my reporting is that parents were being faced with a choice. Schools were saying, would you like us to paddle your children, or would you like us to suspend them? Because if you don't let us paddle them, then we're going to send them home. And so, for families who work, for families who care about their kids getting education and sitting in class and being able to hear the lessons from the teachers, corporal punishment seems like one, the better academic option for a kid. And in some kind of family circumstances, school is childcare. As we all learned during COVID, school is really important childcare for a lot of families. Um, and so, even if they didn't like the idea of corporal punishment, they still chose it over a suspension. And
How
so
do
part of the question, sorry, I'm
How do
jumping
the
too much.
laws allow that? They must be
Yeah,
specifically allowing, except in cases of you can't
right.
strike a child, but it's pretty
Yeah.
explicit in the laws.
Where it remains, it's very open. Schools have a lot of power to decide.
Okay.
Um, so states pass a lot of laws about school discipline. Um, they could restrict. There's a handful of states that restrict it. You can use corporal punishment, but not on kids with disabilities, for example. Mississippi changed their law a few years ago and said you could not use it on students with disabilities. And I saw in the state data, I am waiting for the next round of federal data to see how this plays out. But in the state data, it looked like Mississippi schools, there was a precipitous drop in use of corporal punishment after it
Mm.
was banned on students with disabilities. And I believe that is because the way that it was worded in the law, what I heard from superintendents is that the way it was worded in the law, um, the students with disability category was very big. And
Mhm.
so, when you think of disabilities in schools, it's not just kids with severe intellectual,
Mhm.
cognitive kind of disabilities. This is like ADHD is a disability as well. And so,
504s, things like that.
exactly.
No, yeah.
And so, if the law is worded very broadly, some of the principals I talked to said it's not fair to have a classroom of kids and only be able to use this punishment on one and not the other. And so, we decided not to use it at all. Other states, I am trying to remember which one. I think Oklahoma currently has this in its legislature right now, but their ban on students with disabilities is only students with extreme disabilities. And so I don't expect to see such a precipitous drop in Oklahoma as we have seen in Mississippi in the
Hmm.
last few years. So legislation matters. It is directing school and district behavior. And part of the question in my story is whether this is something that should even be left to the states. Is it fair that we have this increasingly small pool of students who, could face this kind of punishment that is unheard of for most of the country?
Yeah.
But at the federal level, basically the Republican kind of party line is that this is a local control issue, and we need to leave it to people who know their communities best.
Yeah. Well, it sort of amazes me that children can be struck. I mean, legally.
Exactly. And in the states where it remains, in most of them, there are laws on the books that say kids cannot be hit in foster homes. They cannot be hit in juvenile detention facilities. So,
Mm.
it is recognized that it is not acceptable in a lot of different scenarios, but in these states, it remains acceptable in schools.
But in schools, it's okay.
Exactly.
Yikes. Okay.
Actually, just a couple of weeks ago was the International Day to End Corporal Punishment around the country. This is an international movement. In most other countries, it is not, the battle is not over corporal punishment use in schools. It's
Mm.
at home, actually. So dozens of other countries have already banned corporal punishment use at home as well. And I think it's 165 countries that ban it in schools. So basically all of them.
What does a student need to do in order to be punished? I mean,
Oh,
how petty do we have to be in order for this to take effect? Because it seems to me that it could be quite corrupt. So if Philip was an administrator and he didn't like little Johnny B down there, he would just be looking. And so we're dealing with confirmation bias constantly. And
Mhm.
poor little Johnny, he's just standing there because he can't even sit down anymore.
Mm-mm.
So how is there something to that?
yeah, and sociologists and social scientists have done lots of studies to show this and look at the bias that's behind it, the kind of psychological and cultural factors. Um, Punishment is very subjective. In Philip's own case, if the teacher had looked a split second sooner, did the teacher notice you retaliating because the teacher was poised to be looking at you because you were kind of a troublemaker in other cases? Or was it just a kind of accident of timing and the teacher looked over and saw you?
I was a little troublemaker sometimes.
So there are kids that get
So,
reputations. There are teachers that there have been some studies about when teachers are primed to look for misbehavior. Researchers studied what children they watched in watching a group of children, and there were racial differences that teachers tended to watch Black children, expecting them to be the troublemakers in a classroom. So there are a lot of racial elements to this as well. I don't have it in front of
mhm.
me. Yeah.
Okay.
I'm going to
Yeah,
cite general studies here since I'm not looking at any notes.
I know the study that you're talking about. And they look for the 3 Bs. The 3 Bs are receive 50% more suspensions or expulsions. And that's if you are a big Black boy.
Right. Yeah, the data is
Oh,
devastating. The gender
absolutely.
imbalance
Mhm.
is striking. In corporal punishment, it's 80% of
Hmm.
kids who are hit in school settings are boys. The suspension numbers are also the gender imbalance is striking. The racial imbalance, especially for Black children, is striking. And then depending on the location, you have some overrepresentation of Latino students, you have some
Hmm.
overrepresentation of Indigenous students, but Black boys for sure are at a nexus.
Yeah, because I think in that
Yeah.
same study, they monitored how the teachers were actually observing what was going on, and they were not paying attention to any of the other kids who may have been doing things that they should have taken a look at. And
And like you mentioned, confirmation bias, that's part of it.
right.
You see someone doing something who you
Hmm.
already
Yeah.
think is kind of a bad kid. The same exact behavior is filtered through a different lens if you see someone as a good kid.
And it doesn't matter what race you are as a teacher, because they found
Yeah.
it clear across the board.
Well, as a society, we've also encouraged fear of big black men. Many of those criminal characters, those menacing characters, are big black men. And that just is a prejudice that we get from our society, our media, our outlets, everything. We think about that all the time. Big black men are the scariest of all.
But see,
So big
when
black
they talked
boys,
about the three
naturally
Bs,
scary.
this is going to be a little bit of a surprise. They were talking about preschool,
Oof.
that they were talking about 3 and 4 year olds when they were doing it. And it goes back because I was listening to Dr. Rosemary Allen out of Denver, and she was talking about how 8 months old kids will go into a place, they will go into daycare or the pre-K setting, because statistics show that if children enter into a pre-K at an early age, that it actually helps them cognitively to achieve and do better in school in the future. But you
Mhm.
have 8-month-old kids throwing a temper tantrum and being suspended or expelled from the program. And the reason is because kids do this because this is when they learn how to self-regulate. And Philip, you worked in pre-K, and as I did,
I
and
did. I worked in a daycare
for
for
me it
5
was
years.
40 years ago, but it's still the same thing. I mean, a kid would throw a temper tantrum and you just put them to a place where they could be removed, and you'd say, okay, I'm going to keep an eye on you. But when you decide that you can stop and rejoin us, then just let us know. Or if you need anything, let me know. So I would keep an eye on them, but they were removed from the group, and then they could join the group when they were ready. But so they were taken care of. But these people, they talked about how what they were looking for was whether or not they were going to be injurious or be a danger to any of the other students or anybody else. So that was the typical reason for that. But I never would have thought, I never would have considered that back then.
Yeah, we have very little data about discipline in early childhood settings or in preschool or pre-K settings. The federal government reported it out through the civil rights data collection once. I think 2017-18 is the last time we have data, and I think it's the only time we have data. But that data set is incredibly messy. It's pretty untrustworthy in terms of what was showing up there. But there was a
Nice.
survey study done, I want to say out of Yale, that looked at early childhood settings, and it is believed that exclusionary discipline, suspensions, and expulsions are more common in pre-K than at any other grade level. Actually, expulsions in particular.
And those follow the kids because it follows their record, takes them into grade school. So if they were expelled for one reason and they want to go someplace else, well, that's on their record. And then when they're in elementary school, that's still on their record. So what does it teach the kid about what they're worth or their value in a sense, and who's there to help them if they need help, or how do they resolve these issues if whenever they have a need
Yeah.
that's not being met let's say that they're just hyperactive, or maybe you have people who just don't understand that when you have a gang of little
Mm-hmm.
kids, you might as well use super glue, because you're not going to get them all to sit down, and you've got to take a lot of deep breaths. You've got to have a great attitude. But if they're not willing to sit there for 10 minutes quietly, and there's examples of this that in the articles that I was reading, that a kid they will look for confirmation and affirmation from the teacher. But if they don't get it, then they just lose it, and then they get picked on by the teacher. But if they're not getting it then what are we telling them about later on in life? So some of this is actually starting to happen.
Yeah. Two things. One, you pointed out the idea that kids are just learning self-regulation at this time. I have learned some interesting things around teacher training and some elements that are missing around developmentally appropriate behavior. And this is true at the early childhood level, all the way up through adolescence, that teachers they don't get the training to understand what is a developmentally appropriate response to adversity or frustration or embarrassment, things that students are responding to in classrooms in ways that are inappropriate behavior. If the teachers knew more about where it was coming from, that it was a place of not having the skills to problem solve, rather than being a disrespectful kid who was trying to disrupt a classroom because they didn't like the teacher, or something more malicious like that. That little shift that can come from pretty minimal kind of training can really help teachers respond, I think, a little more patiently in the classroom.
Right. And I think,
Um,
and Philip, you and I were talking, I don't remember how long ago, but students tend to act out when they feel lost and they don't feel as though that they can participate they because they don't have
Oh, yeah.
whatever it is. They don't have that chunk of knowledge or
Yeah, well, when Tara said that about that, when they don't get that response from this teacher, then they're left with basically innovating their own responses. And we're talking about 3,
but
4,
even
5-year-olds innovating
adolescents,
their own
even
responses.
teenagers.
Oh, and especially in
Right. They
adolescence too.
innovate and
They'll
they
really
have themselves
innovate.
removed.
Yeah.
So they don't have to so they don't have to feel humiliated,
Yeah.
and they don't have to be the clown.
And like you're saying, a lot of academics call it push out, the process of making kids feel like they are not welcome in schools. And
Mm-hmm.
they get this lesson over and over again if schools continue to push them
Yeah.
out rather than figure out why they're behaving the way they are, or, finding a way to help them stay. The push out ends up looking like
Right.
dropout or forced transfer, or some of these on the edges of exclusionary discipline. Um, Right.
Legal problems. Yeah. Well, and it's well known that in the neighborhoods, when drug dealing showed up, you make a whole lot more money just right away working within that business than you can even
Part of, I mean,
after high school and beyond. So
yeah, and absenteeism is at crisis levels right now, and part of the reason is a lot of kids found out during COVID when
yeah,
they were, school was part-time and online and asynchronous, that a lot of them were working and helping support their families and just never went back.
But then I think what they also may have
yeah,
experienced is a sense of freedom. Because if you are locked up in that building all day and you are experiencing what most workers experience when they have to go into their cubicle all day long, and they get a half hour for lunch, but they're still in the same building, and then they're back in there, and they really don't have any other way to let off some steam, in a sense. And these are
Right.
kids,
no
and it's
recess.
gotten worse ever since we started all this testing, trying to get them going, and we don't allow them the process time or the time to actually just kick up their feet and just feel footloose and fancy free, for lack of a better term. But they need to have a lot more activity, a lot more kinesthetics going on in order for them to process the information, and also just to shake off all this energy, because they're still growing and their brains are still developing until what, 24, 25?
Well, that was part of the kind of early behavior, talking to people, where's all this coming from? Why are we seeing all these behavior problems as schools are reopening? And that's what people were talking about. It's like these kids went for sometimes over a year being able to sit however they wanted, lie down with their laptop on their laps, get up and get snacks whenever they wanted, go to the bathroom whenever they wanted. They didn't have teachers constantly, redirecting their behavior, giving them more rules. So they're coming back. Not only are they having to deal with the kind of social elements of being in groups of kids their age, and dealing with all the things that come with that, all of the rules and structure to school was, they had gotten out of the habit, or for some kids,
Yeah.
they never got into the habit of being a middle schooler or being a high schooler or being in elementary school because they were at those transition points at the beginning of COVID. And so it was a lot of work to get kids used to sitting still for a whole day, following rules for a whole day.
Has there been any research into schools and their structures getting more rigid, or just generally, more discipline structures built in since the pandemic, more rigid attendance policies?
Yeah, in
schedules, things
Arizona,
like that?
I was looking at schools that diverged. So this was the project around schools suspending students for absenteeism and attendance-related infractions. And so
Yeah.
so I worked
Yeah.
on this project with Maria Paletta of the Arizona Center for Investigative Reporting, and we requested data from basically all school districts in the state, and we got back records from about 150. And so we looked at all of their suspensions for over a 5-year period. And so we could see before COVID and after whether there were changes. And we were specifically looking at attendance related suspensions. So we could see schools that trended in one direction or another. And so there were some that suspended for attendance more often after COVID. And in talking to them, they're saying, rules are rules. We spent this many weeks training students on what they needed to be doing, and when they didn't do it, they needed to face a consequence. Whereas you had other schools that said, we are really just trying to get kids here for any length of time. We want them to be in school. We know that the suspension is not going to help them come back after. It's not going to help solve the problem that we're trying to solve. And so we're just not doing that. And so this is a very local kind of problem and question and set of solutions. And so, some schools are definitely making a return to the kind of zero tolerance policies of the 90s. And some are trying a much more generous.
The reason I say that is it's sort of anecdotal evidence, but I guest teach a lot. And I go to multiple schools, and each and every one of them seem to be a little bit more rigid, a little bit more now, we mean this, and security is a little more acute. And I'm thinking that's sort of the wrong direction after a pandemic, to close up and structure more than, because the kids, as Tony was saying, they've been used to lying around their jammies and doing pretty much what they want. And all of a sudden now it's like reality time. And I think the pandemic changed a lot of things. And there's a lot of adults who want things to go back.
But a lot of adults are begging for things not to change for them because they want to stay remote.
Exactly.
But my former high school, in the fall, they did the same thing 2 years running. And I can't believe that they would do that, because somehow or other they thought the results would be different. They began the year not enforcing the rules, just being very lax and letting everybody get used to doing what they should do. And then they put the hammer down right after the holidays. And they said, now you will be on time. Now you will. And I'm thinking, how about you just gracefully start introducing things and get one down, and then sort of let people ease back into what the rules actually are, and start looking for ways to innovate. How do you innovate? How do you address the students? Because you're not showing them a whole lot of grace when everything's still the same. You just try to repackage it in some kind of used gift bag that doesn't work.
It's interesting also the timing where you're saying when they started to crack down on it, because there was just a study that came out Jason Akonafua, and I'm sure I'm butchering his last name, but he is in California, and he was on a team of researchers who looked at lots and lots of data to see and track the kind of rises and falls in suspensions over the course of a school year. And I'm pretty sure one of the peaks was right before a holiday, the winter break. And so I'm just wondering, I want to look at that team's chart again and see. That seems like probably not a good time.
Well, actually, that just prior to Thanksgiving and going up to the winter break is the hardest time for a lot of the students, especially students in alternative ed, because that is when their families are going to be going on. The kids are all fed because they go to school.
Right.
They have breakfast and they have lunch. And the school where I was, we provided food boxes. We did all kinds of things for the families. And so we would put things together, and they would do that, but they would do it for the kids that they had that they would target. They weren't able to get all the students. And they said, well, we just can't in a school of over 2,000 kids. But if you think about how you have nothing, and yet you see these people from your viewpoint, experiencing all this largesse, and you kind of want that, but you're just fighting for survival, and it's cold, and maybe you don't have enough heat. So this is a time of crisis for them. So, and then when they come back from that, people say, did you have a good holiday? And instead of saying, what do you need? How was your break? Which is far simpler. But I think everybody wants to share in what they experienced. But and this goes back to what you were talking about. How do you address these little tweaks in addressing those students?
Well, part of it is even knowing what's going on with each individual student. And some teachers in some schools, sometimes there's the setup where teachers can get to know their students. Sometimes I know it is the case that there are structures keeping that from happening. Sometimes it's teachers that are not choosing to do that. But yeah, if you don't even know, how can you possibly offer the more generous kind of reaction?
Well, I think you have to care. And I think, and in a sense, caring, you have to be vulnerable. And there may be something about being vulnerable that terrifies many teachers, I think, because they feel that puts them down at the student level. But students want a real teacher. They want somebody that they can talk to. And that doesn't mean that you lose your seniority, or I don't know what else you would call
authority.
it. Authority, yes. Over them, but respect you more when you can be frank with them, but you're frank in a caring kind of way. They may not like what you say, but but you have, it's fair, but you also have to take a look, and you have to come up with some ideas.
Be fair.
And you have to be
consistent.
Willing to throw the rules out the door and say, okay, instead of that today, let's do this, and get something going where you're not fighting any of the kids. You're doing something, because just quiet work doesn't always. How do you build a community in your own classroom?
One of the issues with the kids too over the holidays is that some of them do not want to spend that time around their family or parents, or there's
sometimes it's a lot of abuse.
They just don't want to be around. And the thought of, oh my God, yeah, 2 weeks.
Plenty of adults don't. I mean, there's always so much chatter about how do you get through the Thanksgiving dinner with your families? It doesn't end.
No, it doesn't. And a lot of them act out just to get things riled up. I don't know if they're doing it intentionally. They don't have an objective so much as they just, again, don't know how to handle it.
It's self-regulation, and with trauma-informed education. And if you've been trauma-informed trained, these are things that you work on with the students. But it's hard for a classroom teacher with 38 kids in the classroom to teach a kid how to self-regulate. I mean, how do you do that while you're working with all of the others? And so what are the strategies that you have? So you need to be able to develop a relationship with that one student and have some kind of a cue with them. Don't share that cue with another teacher. They need to figure that out on their own. But you develop your own relationship with that student, and that's what's going to carry you. And it's going to help. But I think that, and I think you pointed this out by saying that we do need to establish the relationships. That's sort of the foundation of everything, anyway. And I don't think that people know how to
Yeah.
do that. I know people who talk relationships, but they don't know how to do it. But I think that you've got to be able to vary things. You have to be, what do you do with your own kids? Let's put it that way. If you've got your own children and you want them to do something, how do you convince them that they are going to do it and you turn it into a learning and fun experience? Sometimes you have to throw the rules out the door and you just have to say, you know what, let's do this instead. And sometimes you end up with something far better. And it
Yeah,
helps.
but sometimes it's often challenging, right? Sometimes you have the
Right.
patience. I think people, I
Yeah.
I've worked in a childcare setting for it was a work study job in college. So I have a little bit of childcare setting. I've done like summer camps teaching high school students investigative reporting, but I've never been in a classroom tasked with developing relationships with kids over the course of the year. But I think a lot of us who have not been in schools can think about our parenting interactions and have that help create a little
Mhm.
bit of empathy with teachers and kind of the challenge in front of you all. But I know even just in parenting conversations, it requires so much patience to help kids through tantrums and to help them through all of all of the ups and downs in a kid's day. And it's been interesting this year. I am a much better parent because of all the research I've done into school discipline. So the
I
lessons are
would think.
going in both directions for sure.
Yeah. And teachers are not, we're not psychoanalysts. We are not therapists. We So don't count on us to be able to do everything because teachers they're pulled really, really thin now, and they're still being asked to do more. They're the frogs in the pot, in a sense, is what people tell me. And I experienced that. But now let's move on to PBIS because you bring this up, and whether or not, and for those of you who don't know, it's the positive behavior.
Interventions and supports. Yeah.
How does that work? And from your perspective, what does that do and how does that work? And is it effective, or are people manipulating it so that it works the way that they want it to work rather than the way it's supposed to be working?
Yeah, well, PBIS is one of the most studied behavior interventions in schools. So it's one that, for example, is in the federal legislation that is would ban corporal punishment in schools. Part of the legislation is to say, we want to take away this disciplinary option for schools, and we are also going to create this pool of money to help train schools and PBIS. So it's one that has a lot of research support behind it. When implemented well, it can work very well to help schools manage student behavior and create more smoothly functioning systems. But this does come up in my corporal punishment story. The school that I was drawn to in Mississippi, because of data showing that they use corporal punishment more widely across their student body than any other school in the country. They also are the district leader in PBIS, and so there are times. So what PBIS, the model is generally that you have a multi-tiered system where you have universal kind of policies so in the discipline case you have often schools will have a discipline matrix, and these are the behaviors that you should be showing in different settings. If so just setting the proper expectations for kids often creates, for a huge chunk of kids, that's enough tell them the rules and they will follow them. So for kids that need more,
Mhm.
then you create additional interventions that will help keep those kids on track. So if you have a kid who starts acting out before lunch every day, you kind of notice that trend and can set up something to help, maybe give them a snack or distract them before lunch to kind of keep them on task. So that's the kind of individual student level interventions. And then for kids that need even more, that's when you turn outside of the classroom and get more, get a social worker involved, a counselor, something like that. And so the goal, it's called positive behavioral interventions and supports. The goal is helping redirect student behavior in more positive ways. A lot of schools use incentive systems to try and incentivize good behavior, but really this model can be fit around all kinds of discipline. So it is not the case that this removes the need to discipline a child. And so for this school, they had kind of a green, yellow, red system. When kids were behaving well, they were in a green, and then you kind of went through the stoplight there. When you hit red, you needed some kind of punitive response according to the school's protocol, and sometimes the punitive response is being sent to the principal's office to get paddled. And so PBIS leaders in Mississippi said that that wasn't the way the system was supposed to be implemented. This wasn't kind of the vision of PBIS, but the school had a reputation in the county that they had gone through more trainings. They were farther along in implementing PBIS. And so you see, I mean, the devil's in the details.
Right.
Implementation is important.
Yeah.
So it can go either way, but PBIS is a system that in legislation I'm seeing all over the country that is recommending schools move away from punitive discipline. PBIS is routinely recommended as one that schools should implement.
Right. You have a series of, you just reminded me of what it was. There are tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3 students. Tier
Right.
1 are the regular kids, the kids that don't seem to have any kind of an issue. Tier 2 are the ones who just aren't quite fitting in quite right. And tier 3 are the high flyers. They're the ones that you really have an eye on. And there's very few of those. So in order to, and you find all kinds of supports for them. The other supports for the other kids tend to be easily moderated and taken care of. So I'm just kind of surprised that they would resort to corporal punishment for those students. And then, and not to like flip us around, but it feels like we could ask about the transfer students in California, because is California implementing PBIS? And are they doing the RTI, which is route to intervention?
Mm-hmm.
Uh,
I am not sure what the statewide recommendations are around PBIS. I would be shocked if California Department of Education were not encouraging schools to go that route. From what I know about California, it seems like they probably have a pretty robust statewide support for helping schools implement PBIS, but that is assumption based on minimal research in that direction.
Okay, so my other question then is, why would they transfer a kid to another school to get rid of them and make that child another school's problem then? They haven't addressed anything. They're not going through normal protocols. The parents don't feel as though they have any recourse, correct?
Right.
Because they're not really given any kind of no sense of direction or knowledge about what they can do. Can they sue the district and stop it? But do most of these parents even have the means to do something like that?
Yeah, I'm not sure what the grounds would be for suing. And because of the vagueness in the law, schools do have some protections. So yeah, I haven't heard of anybody suing to stop a transfer. There are people who retain attorneys to help them fight it. But because state law gives students no real protections to fight a transfer, they don't really have the grounds to go off of. And so, or ground to build on, I guess would be the saying. So attorneys will try and convince the district to change their minds and take back the transfer. But once it's approved, there's very little option.
16,300 in 1 year.
Yeah.
And that averages, I think, what did we say, 661 per alternative program, because there were 53 alternative programs in that area, which is a huge influx. And they probably went out to some other schools too, or some other
No, but
programs.
you are, sorry, no. So you're pulling in data that we looked at, or that I got across about 20 different districts. The school number you're citing, the 53 alternative schools, is LA Unified.
Right.
And so for LA, I actually did not get the data about the number of students transferred. That was something that they were clearly reporting incorrectly to the state. But yeah, there were 53 alternative schools. You have enrollment records from the state that show there are tens of thousands of students enrolled in those schools, but there's no transfer records to indicate how they got there. So LA Unified was kind of a strange case. But the 16,300, that was across 20 large districts in California that I looked for. Those were students transferred to alternative schools.
That's still a huge number. And the alternative schools, I'm not sure how they fund alternative schools and programs in California. Here in Oregon, private alternative schools receive 80% of what it takes to educate a child in the regular school. And but charter schools,
how did they settle on that?
I don't remember. I work with a couple of people from the Department of Ed, and they keep explaining it to me, but it just makes no sense to me.
Is it safe to assume that there are as many different policies and procedures for transfer and removal of students
for sure as there are districts? And I would say
basically everybody has their own way to do it, right?
Even more than that, because you have a district level policy that some principals will decide to interpret one way and others, there are plenty of principals that would say, I'm never going to kick a kid out. I don't want to do this forced transfer. And so that'll never happen in some schools, where you have others that will recommend a student for a transfer. Ultimately in California, the transfer decision comes from the district level. So the way it would work is a principal would recommend a student for transfer, and then the district a district person would be the one actually assigning it. But yeah, discipline is very local.
How does that address the issues that the student is having? Because in the research, if you look at students that are transferred to an alternative school, it doesn't matter what state it is, unless they have an individual learning plan that follows them. And if you have no records, they don't know where they are. What kinds of assessments are being run on the students when they show up? And do they have the staff? Do they have the resources? Because I believe that you and I were talking, and you even talked about how under-resourced and underfunded many of those programs are. And I get the same thing from different departments of ed in different states. So why are you taking a kid because alternative education requires far more resources. You don't give them the money. You treat them like a garbage dump, and you send these kids there, and then you sit there and say, we are champions of our children and our future. It's a gaslight, isn't it? And it's so disrespectful of the community that you work in.
Yeah, it's difficult, and it's really hard to examine closely alternatives. The alternative education sector is very difficult to regulate. We have these accountability systems set up. We're monitoring standardized test scores. We're monitoring graduation rates, absenteeism rates for our traditional schools. And with good reason, alternative school leaders are saying these are not great metrics for us to look at. The reason our kids come here is because many of them are at risk of dropping out. They're failing many classes. They don't show up to school. And so I am not aware. I would love to hear of a state that has found a way to set up an accountability system for alternative schools that encourages good school design, that incentivizes the right kinds of responses to students, that doesn't just let them, or doesn't just keep kicking them out, doesn't just, resort to suspension or do really extreme kind of lockdown policies that encourage kids to just drop out of their own accord. But it's difficult to incentivize, and there's very little data for that reason. So in California, for example, the alternative schools have a whole separate accountability system. Um, they're called DAS schools, which I'm forgetting what that acronym stands for, but it's difficult to even find out what's happening in many of these schools. It's difficult to get information about the quality of the curriculum. Um, so it's hard to report on. It's hard to, I'm
Yeah.
sure it's hard to study kind of generally. And so because that is the case, if there's not a lot of information, kind of granular information about how these schools function and how they function as a sector, as a group, that might lead to good informed policymaking, because that's all difficult to get. How do we come up with solutions?
Exactly. But I think the
Yeah.
best alternative schools are the ones that address the canary in the coal mine and figure out a way to keep it alive on the spot, and then work from there in order to maintain and build up a community of respect for the students so that they are able to learn, and it includes the parents. But alternative schools are not all going to be the same, and you
Mm-hmm.
can't legislate that alternative schools must be the same. Because Philip comes into my program, I have to figure out where Philip's gaps are. I have to know what he needs to learn so that he can be successful, and so he can continue to go. So maybe he's at the third grade level of reading. He can't write, and maybe he doesn't know very much in math. He can't even do a basic addition, subtraction, multiplication, division problem. You're a junior.
What grade level?
Yeah, you're a junior.
This is high school.
But
So you've
somehow
got
or
1
other,
year to turn it around, or
okay.
else he's not going to graduate.
yeah, but he's a smart kid. I mean, there's something about him. I see it in his eyes. But we're going to start working with that. And so little by little, a good alternative ed program and a good alternative ed staff doesn't look at him as a loser, because he's not, because he's here at school. So that's a huge step. So we have to figure out, how are we going to get that? So I'm going to converse with him, and we're going to start feeding him little pieces of things and showing him and giving him relevant components so that he can,
the next best place,
so that everything is
best,
coming along, and actually
result.
we're able to start getting him so that he will be able to, maybe if he has to get his GED, or maybe because he doesn't have that number of credits, or maybe we can find a way that we can fast track those credits because he's got it. And so he's just a brilliant guy. And so we can get him there.
I was just sloughing off for the first 17 years of my
But
life.
I think the little by little piece is what is so challenging. And I'm trying to put myself, as I'm doing all this research, and as I'm pointing out all of these things that I'm saying schools shouldn't do them. They're being criticized for all these punitive policies. So what should they do? And I spoke with a wonderful alternative school principal in Arizona, which was the third story in this series about suspending for absenteeism, focuses a decent amount on an alternative school in Chandler, Arizona. And the principal described all of these things that you just described. And it really is a little by little process, and winning the trust of a student, in convincing them to come back. It's just hard to imagine how that can be implemented at scale. She runs a very small school. She is willing to keep pushing, keep feeding the positive messages to a kid as they continue to kind of show up to school only a couple times a week or come late, insisting that she is not going to suspend them for behavior that would have gotten them suspended in other schools, because she knows that that's not going to help. It works great in her school, it sounds like. But when is there time to educate around all of that? And
You have to take your head out of the regular mainstream classroom.
Yes, and you have to
You can't have
your
more than
environment
15
smaller.
to 18
You
kids in
can't
the
have
room. 18
200,
is
300.
really blowing out the walls.
Yeah. I'm saying 100 on the whole school grounds.
Well, it depends on how many staff you have and how big your facility is. Philip took over. Philip took over after me in a one-room schoolhouse, and I started out with 18 students, and some of them would just pop in because they were part of a shelter program. So I might have them for a day, and then they were gone, and maybe somebody else came in. But
what were the ages, the range?
it was I want to say
high school,
14 to 18.
Right. When I first started, it was
Usually
7th grade through 12th.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah.
But what we did was there's a way to incorporate. If you take a look at what skills all students need, you can run a program that way. You can talk about books. You can talk about writing. You can talk about social studies and government. You can talk about all these other pieces, and then you can give people like independent study that they can work on. So yeah, because that way, if they have questions or they want to do something, or they're not really understanding what's going on, then they know by just raising their hand and saying, "Yo, what am I doing here? What is this? What am I looking at?" Every place is different on how they do it. I worked in a program where every Monday morning the students would come in and we would teach them basic skills like how do you tell time? How do you use a ruler? What's measurement? And then we would also teach maybe something fun that we wanted to learn, and they would do it. And so that would be just kind of working in the elements, the rudimentary elements that were required just to get along in life.
I think one of the cardinal sins of education today is that classrooms just have too many students. It's just too many students. It ruins absolutely everything. You cannot teach effectively a group that you can't relate to or identify with or even develop a relationship with at all. Or if you have a kid that develops an adversarial relationship right off the bat, and then you've got like 25 kids, that's more room for that kid to innovate within that role. And you've lost the environment that is conducive to learning. And I think that's
it's also Dickensian
today.
It's Dickensian.
Pardon me?
It's right out of Dickens, if you think about it. You don't follow the line, you get kicked out. Mr. Bumble takes you and kicks you out on the streets. And he puts you someplace else where you're going to be somebody else's problem. You're no longer there.
By the air.
But we're going to keep all these good little workers.
More food,
And I'm referring to all of
exactly. Yeah, you want your classroom to hum along.
The workhouse.
And just get rid of that.
We changed out the workhouses for schools.
The workhouse. You're right. Took them out by the ear because
the problem of scale is extreme, though. I mean, we pledge in this country, we say in this country that every child deserves a public education. I read a devastating story by Eli Saslow in the Washington Post about a teacher who came from the Philippines to a school in Arizona, and she's a highly qualified teacher in the Philippines. And for staff shortages, she was recruited to come here, and she came because of the massive pay bump that it would get. And she arrived, and her classroom was mayhem. I mean, it was just chaos, and she was a hugely successful veteran teacher in the Philippines, but never faced the kind of behavior problems that she was seeing in these Arizona schools. And I really think part of that comes down to the free public education that we have here, the free compulsory public education that we have here. In other countries, students approach education differently. It's there's just a cultural difference to it that I think it's also hard to overcome.
Families approach it differently too. I mean, their respect for it, I think. So, and I think we were a little late to the game in the way that we began public education And we made it compulsory around the turn of the century, between the 19th and the 20th century. I mean, it was in those 20 years or so, I think. I think we discussed
late 1890s.
Well, we talked about it because it's in the Nicole Goyle book.
Right.
And we used to have apprenticeships, and we don't have that anymore. And so now everybody says everybody has to go to college. Well, I don't want to go to college because I hear all these people saying that they spend too much money to go to college, and I don't want to be there in debt. I have former students who are out buying houses. They've been working since they graduated. They're 25, and a couple of them are going off to buy another house because they're going to rent that one to their family. And, I mean, they're figuring things out, and they're very good at what they do for a living. And they didn't go to college, and they just went right to work. So I think we like to promote things without really looking at what the consequences are for everybody.
Or the inertia, like Tara was saying. It just has the inertia. It just keeps rolling until someone goes, what are we doing? Oh, I hadn't thought about it in a while.
Lack of innovation. And when we do see innovation, then there's such a huge pushback because the educational machine, because we have the education industrial complex that's worth billions upon billions of dollars.
Everything's that way.
Everything is that way. But these are kids that really need to have it. And so they should be funding alternative education the same as they do regular education.
I'm surprised. I'm not sure. I would like to look at some national statistics. I would be surprised if most states do it the way Oregon does in having an 80% per pupil. In California, from what I understand, districts run the alternative schools. They're not, the way that you're describing it sounds like a charter school setup where you have an independent charter school that gets, the state sets the per pupil.
Yeah.
Charter schools in Oregon get 95%.
Oh my goodness. Someone needs to write a story about that.
So the contract, it's the private contract. It's the private contract schools the private contract alternative schools in Oregon that get the 80%.
Okay. And so then district run alternative schools would get 100%?
Right.
Essentially, because the district would,
Right. But what we've discovered and what we've seen throughout the years is that there are no real training programs for alternative ed. And so there's just really nothing. It's a desert out there. And just to teach people how to be, they have to be empathetic. Because you can't fake that. You can't learn that. You just have to. And you also have to be willing to take risks. You have to be able to be innovative. You have to be relentless in the pursuit of the next thing and be open-minded. And I think that our pre-K work that we did was some of the best training that we actually had for alternative education, because you can turn on a dime and you have a plethora of ideas to use. So you got to take your ego out of it, because in alternative ed, you can't have ego. You've got to be there for the kids, and ego just blocks all of that.
One of the other things about alternative ed is it's more expensive actually than regular.
Well, yeah, because you need more resources.
Comes with a higher price. You need more resources. The kids come with more resources because of the learning disability or the 504 IEP thing. And so they kind of become a little bit of resented because they are expensive. And so, how come they were how come they get so much of a budget? How come this alternative school, gets 1.5, 1.75 funding, and it goes with the students. They're cutting one of the schools out of the district that I live in up here in Washington State. It's the more expensive of the two alternatives, and the kids were 1.6 funding or something, and then the other alternative is like 1.2 per student. It was a really good small environment school, really, really smartly designed, beautiful facility, and now they're going to kind of double the population and lower the cost per student. So it was first on the cutting board because it was so expensive.
Yeah, there are difficult politics around that for sure. The kind of inter-district zero-sum that budgets are kind of politics.
Yeah.
Because in some ways there is an incentive to transfer more kids. Disciplinary transfers to alternative schools make sense if you want to fully enroll your alternative schools, because the lower, if they're not filled to their capacity, then the per pupil cost is more because you're still paying for the staff.
Mm-hmm.
And so
Very true.
in some ways, a push to reduce disciplinary transfers is going to disrupt in some districts enrollment in alternative schools to an extent that is going to mess up budgets and maybe force closures that then makes schools that might be good for students for other reasons, no longer exist.
That's a very good point. I hadn't thought of that.
Well, there's always a consequence for any kind of action. So you have to take all of that into account, and that's very true. But as far as alternative students can also be given a menu. And
that is a good approach. We had an administrator that had that approach.
And if you have a menu of options, because look, Tara, it's not working out for you here. I love you to death, but it's just not working out. I want you to start considering what it is that you want to do and how we can best help you. And it doesn't mean you're going to lose us, but but maybe we can find a better place for you. And if you need to come back, you can. This isn't permanent, but just some way, and then give that menu to the student and just say, think about it. And if you need help, I will go with you and I will take you there or whatever. That's
so interesting, though, I have to say, because that is a very similar conversation to some of the ones that I reported on in a more negative kind of context, where kids and families are counseled out and said, it's not working for you here. And the message to students is, we don't want you here.
Mm-hmm.
And so depending, it's all in the messenger. Like, what is the intention of the person who's saying it? I could see that message being delivered in a very kind and supportive way, and also know that it's probably often delivered in a not so kind and supportive way, which makes it difficult to create policy and create rules around what's allowed and what is bad, and what is punitive discipline versus what is a supportive kind of attempt to find something that really works for a kid.
We had a really good system. You recall, we had so many different programs. Or the high school, I had attendance policy usually, and if the kid was in attendance trouble, it'd be a contract, and if they violated that contract, it was 3 times, then I'd let them go, and it was very consistent. But there was other places for them to go, and I told them, listen, go figure it out. If you want back in after a few months, come talk to me again. I'm not adverse to that, but you have to change. And I had every kid that came back graduate. They were stellar once they came back. But I always kept the door open, and we had other programs. We had other means, like, okay, you're not working it out here. You're going to go to another program. And if you want back, I'll talk to you. But, and so we kind of had, and we didn't give up on the kids. We had different places to try them out in. And generally speaking, they really appreciated that. They found a fit, or they came back. So we didn't try to weed anybody out per se, but be very consistent with our policies. So they knew that when they were in school, they had to do the school thing. They had to come to school to do the school thing. And they had to have a behavior standard that was normal, and that was it. They're pretty basic, but there it was.
But the one-room schoolhouse where we taught, if a kid didn't make it there, then they were put into shackles and they were kind of bussed off.
Oh, your guy. Yeah. Well, yeah, because they were in violation.
But here's the odd thing. Here's the odd thing. I still heard back from mine, and I went down to the what do you call it? The lockup for the students. And I would go down there because I had friends who worked down there, and occasionally I'd be there. And the kids would just get so excited and they'd see me and they go, Tony. And it was just,
Yeah, that's weird.
it was, I mean, you have that relationship with them. So it's not, they make choices on their own. It's not you. But, schools have a 1 to 14% impact on student outcomes.
Of their lives.
Well, yeah.
General. Anything, the outcome of everything, 1 to 14.
Because 86 to 99% of those outcomes are determined by environmental factors outside of the school.
Yeah, that's what I can't think too much about those statistics. And I bet teachers have a hard time paying too close attention to them too, because then what are we doing focusing on schools? We want our schools to do so much, and it's good to keep in mind those statistics. And it also feels very difficult because then it's like, well, what other lever do we have as a society if we can't look to the schools to fix everything?
Well, we're not fixers. We are builders.
Mm-hmm.
And if you seek us to fix things, then what you're going to get is a cockamamie contraption.
You don't want me.
But if you want us to build something, we can take whatever you give us. That's the beauty. That's the beauty of good educators, I think, is that you can take something and you can build something with it, as long as it's willing to be malleable and to be open to the learning. But the teacher also has to be there. And the circumstances have to be right too, which they are for 99% of the time. So, and that's another beauty of alternative education, are the people that think that way. And as far as what would a successful alternative school look like, I will put in the show notes and I will shoot it to you. There are the standards that are put out by the National Alternative Education Association. So that is one way to look at it.
But I'll have to dig into those.
And I think every district looks to find a way to create an alternative program depending on the needs of their population. New York City has completion schools, and they also have the transfer schools. Mm-hmm. You have people who are doing remote learning now. You have, I don't know, there are so many different variations on what schools can do now as far as alternatives. So I think we're going in the right direction, but people have to quit looking at us as the dumpsters and trying to set us on fire. But, I don't know. Tara, I've learned so much from you today. Seriously.
Yeah, it's an amazing amount. Yeah.
I mean, thank you for all your work. Seriously.
Yes. Thank you for reading it. Thank you for engaging with it.
Thank you so much.
And so I want to sign off by saying I'm going to put your links down in the show notes. So if anybody wants to read your articles, and there is a link on the articles where you can email her, you just click it, correct?
Yep, that's right. Come straight to me. Yep. And I should also plug the Heck-in-jur Reports newsletters. A lot of the topics we covered today are delved into much more deeply by some of my colleagues. We have an early childhood education newsletter. We have a future of learning newsletter that focuses on education innovation and some of these best practices. We also have a higher education newsletter. And then our main newsletter allows people to once a week get all of everything that published in the prior week. So you see some of our really in-depth reporting.
And I'm going to say that you are privately funded, which means that any contribution that anybody can make to the Hechinger Report is greatly appreciated.
That's right. Become a member. It only takes $35. But read our stuff for free if you can't afford it. We love donations, but also we are here to serve.
And it's fantastic stuff. It comes in my mailbox. I read it first thing in the morning, and I'm set for the day, and it gives me so much to think about. So thank you. And so with that, I am going to say Everybody have a wonderful week. So until then, be safe. We will see you then. Bye-bye.
Aloha.